This afternoon, we're pleased to welcome to our campus the Democratic candidate for Secretary of State, Mr. Norbert Schlei. Mr. Schlei graduated from the Yale Law School, magna cum laude, and went on to serve Supreme Court Justice Harlan as a clerk. In 1962, he came to Washington and has been known for his work as legal counsel. Drafted, with much work by him, were such bills as the 1965 Voting Rights Bill, the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, the Immigration Reform Act, 1965, and the poverty legislation. In 1962, he became nationally known and internationally known for his work on the Cuban quarantine in the Cuban crisis. He will speak to you for 20 minutes or a half hour, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Also, I'd like to remind you that later on this afternoon, although declining to appear at this time, the current Secretary of State, Frank Jordan, will be here, so you're welcome to come back and compare notes. It is now my pleasure to welcome on behalf of the Speakers Program, Mr. Norbert Schlei.
Let's see, am I gonna need that, or should I? What about the microphone situation? I'll try it without it. I've spent the last couple of days traveling around the state with my old boss, Senator Kennedy, and really I'm a little bit the worse for wear. The suit I had on is missing several buttons, and my shoes will never be the same. I've lost a cufflink. The reaction of crowds to that man is such that I think he has a future in store for him. He said that he came out here, was sent out here by the people of New York to look into the balance of exchange between our two states. He said New York sent California its first Anglo-Saxon settler, and he gave the fellow's name. He said, we sent you the movie industry. It was in New York, and we sent it out to you. And we gave you the Dodgers. And he said, you've been good enough to send us Richard Nixon. So I came out to see what else we might have available that could redress the balance of the exchange.
Proposition 14.
Yeah, we'd like to send him that too. He said everybody in the East, now that Congress is adjourned, is away on a trip. President Johnson is over in the Far East, and he's out here in California. Vice President Humphrey is traveling around the East trying to elect Democratic congressional candidates. And he said that he gotten a telegram from his younger brother which said, everybody's gone and I've seized power. But don't worry, I like you and I'm going to appoint you to something. At Lakewood, there was a young fellow up in a tree who was waving a Reagan sign. And he said, young fellow, do you realize that if you fell out of that tree and you were over 65 years of age and Reagan was the governor, you wouldn't have Medicare? He's a remarkable man, and I enjoyed making the trip. We've developed a sort of a campaign joke in my campaign that revolves about my name. You know, my first name is Norbert, and most people figure that's got to be a misprint, so they call me Herbert or Robert, Hobart or Norman or something. There's a little town on the other side of the Sierra in the north called Susanville. It's really more like Nevada than California. People wear cowboy clothes. And everybody there thinks my name is Norbert Schlei. I kept trying to catch the fellow who was introducing me, but he was just out of reach all afternoon introducing me as Hobart. And of course the Schlei part is even worse. People have trouble with the spelling and the pronunciation. They call me Mr. Schlei and Mr. Schley. The championship, the world's championship pronunciation is held by a radio announcer in Santa Rosa who got in 3 syllables. It's something like shillelagh. Back in the primary campaign, this was one of our major worries. We really were concerned about how we were going to get this awful name across to people. And we thought of rhyming slogans and all kinds of stratagems. And my favorite suggestion was one that was made by Bill Cohen, who's an old friend of mine, the law professor right here at UCLA. He said that I ought to make a TV spot in which I'd be dressed in cowboy clothes, and I'd be on horseback, and I'd come galloping out of the desert and up to the camera, and I'd say, you may not believe this, but my name is Norbert Schlei. I guess if I were going to carry that out, I'd whip out a ballot and tear it open with my teeth and talk about being Secretary of State. But actually, I'm glad we didn't sink that low in the primary campaign, because it turned out not to be all that hard to win the primary election. And I've really come to the conclusion that it's an advantage in politics to have an unusual name. People don't get you mixed up with the other Norbert Schlei. I'd like to tell you today something about my background so that you'll feel that you know me, and something about how I got in this fix of running for office, and something about the job that I'm trying to get elected to, what I'd like to accomplish in it if I can get it, and then maybe a word about the specific campaign situation we're in, and then I'll try to field the questions that you have for me. I've spent the last 3.5 years being Assistant Attorney General of the United States. That's a job to which I was appointed by President Kennedy in August of 1962 to replace a man who's been in the headlines the last couple of weeks, a man named Nick Katzenbach. I replaced him, and he replaced a man named Byron White, who was appointed to the Supreme Court. And I think that I got in that job some of the most spectacular experience that a young man could want who seeks to build a career in government and politics. I was the Assistant Attorney General who had charge of a part of the Department of Justice called the Office of Legal Counsel. And that's an office of about 45 people, including some of the ablest career lawyers in the government. And its function is to help the Attorney General wear his hat as the President's lawyer, the legal advisor to the President and the Cabinet. The Attorney General has a long string of jobs. He's the head of the FBI and the Immigration Service and the Criminal Division and the Antitrust Division. But one of his jobs is to be the President's lawyer, and the Office of Legal Counsel is sort of the President's law firm that carries out this function. And he gets involved in every major presidential decision that has any significant legal problems mixed up in it. For example, the very first job I was asked to do when I went to Washington in August of 1962 was to do a study for President Kennedy of what the United States could do as a matter of international law in the event that the Soviet Union should try to do such a thing as to put missiles in Cuba. And if you'll think back to those months, you'll remember that the Cuban Missile Crisis arose in October, a little past the middle of October 1962. This was the previous August. We were trying to figure out what we could do if the Soviet Union did some of the things that were possible. The immediate objective was to put out a warning statement so that the Soviet Union would not go ahead and do some of these things in the mistaken belief that we would stand idly by and let it happen. We did issue 2 warning statements in September that were quite explicit, and while the Soviet Union paid no attention, it was very helpful in October in dealing with the world community that we had stated in September what position we intended to defend, what our view of the rights and duties of the matter were. And so back there in August of 1962, 6 weeks away from running for the Assembly here in Southern California and trying lawsuits downtown, I found myself formulating the idea of a partial blockade. I called it a visit and search blockade. There isn't any name for it, wasn't any. And the name that it's known by now, and probably always will be known, was given to it by President Kennedy himself. He called it a quarantine. And it always seemed to me that that was a remarkable example of the almost magical ability that man had to communicate the essence of a complicated idea to millions of people. Because that's what it was. It was not a blockade that shuts off all traffic, people and food and medicines and what have you. It was a quarantine that screened out from Cuba the offensive weapons that we felt that we in the OAS had a right to keep out of the Western Hemisphere. Actually, we issued those warning statements in September, and after that, I've turned my attention away from that problem and to the development of a crisis that was building in the state of Mississippi over the lawsuit that had been brought by a man named Meredith, James Meredith, to get admitted to the University of Mississippi. It took him about 3 years to get an order that was completely final, directing his admission to that university. And it may interest you to know that the only issue there was in that lawsuit that took 3 years to get over with was whether the University of Mississippi was a segregated institution. The state of Mississippi took the position that it wasn't segregated at all. dictated that there just didn't happen to be any Negro students. They just did not have any applications from anybody who was qualified. And in Meredith's case, they took the position that he had gone to a non-accredited school. Of course, it was a public school of the state of Mississippi, but they said they hadn't had enough experience evaluating the performance of graduates of that school and the university, and therefore they couldn't give him full credit for having gone there. But after 3 years, he got over those obstacles and got the order, and it became a question of trying to enforce that order. And the President and the Attorney General felt that it would be much better for the country and for Meredith and for everybody if we could find a way of getting the state of Mississippi to enforce that order, to accept it and to carry it out voluntarily. We didn't have to shove it down their throats. And so we began a series of negotiations with a man named Ross Barnett, who was the governor of Mississippi at that time. He was really a fantastic character. He made it very clear to us, at least, that he really didn't care if Meredith went to university, so long as it could be made clear that it was shoved down his throat by force, that he was made to yield by the superior force of the federal government. He kept proposing these absurd tableaus in which he would be barring the gate and the federal marshals would draw their guns and he would fall back. And it was obvious that if we tried any such tableau with hundreds of Ku Kluxers standing around, the war would be on, and it was not possible for many weeks a couple of weeks anyway, to work out any kind of an arrangement. So that effort brought us down to the 29th, I guess it was, of September 1962, and I was working about 6 o'clock on the order and proclamation that the President would have to sign in order to use the armed forces of the United States to carry out that order of the court. And Burke Marshall came by and said, "We can go home. We've got a deal with Barnett. The order is going to be enforced. Meredith is going to be registered voluntarily. Let's go home." Well, I'd seen and heard enough of Barnett to believe that no deal with him was very reliable. So I kept my secretary and finished the documents in final form and got done, I guess, about 10:30. I went home to dinner, made myself a drink. About halfway through it when Marshall called back again and said, "The deal is off. The President wants to sign the order, go on down to the White House and give them to him." So I drove down to the White House and went up to the living quarters part, the third floor. The President took me in a little room up there called the Indian Treaty Room, I think. And we sat down at this long oval table, talked about the order and the proclamation, and he signed them, and we talked a while about what date we should put on them, because neither one of us could remember which side of midnight he'd signed them on. It was a matter of seconds either way. Finally got up and started out. He turned out the light, and as we were walking out, he was obviously struck by a wry thought. You know, we just signed this order calling out the armed forces of the United States to enforce federal law in the state of Mississippi. And he was struck by this thought, and he smiled a wry smile and rapped on the table and said, "You know, that's General Grant's table." And you know, General Grant's soldiers were actually quartered in the Lyceum building at the University of Mississippi, the wounded, after the Battle of Vicksburg. And we started on out of the room, and I went downstairs to tell the press what we'd done. And he came hurrying back to the balustrade and leaned over and said, "Wait," he said, "don't tell the press about General Grant's table." And I just, the next day, I went down to Oxford, Mississippi with Nick Katzenbach, and that evening there occurred the riot that you read about in your Monday morning newspapers out here, in which 2,500, 3,000 people really went berserk. 2 people were killed, hundreds of people were seriously hurt in that riot down there, and I got an opportunity to see how close human beings are to savagery. And the strange thing is that about half of those people that were there trying to kill each other with bricks and lead pipes and guns looked very much like you. They were, about half of the people in that mob were college students, well-to-do enough to be there in a university that involves a certain amount of expense, educated well enough to be in an accredited college, the best college across a wide area of the South. And they were absolutely mad, absolutely like animals, trying to commit the crime of attempted murder. The little reserve unit there in Oxford, Mississippi arrived about midnight, and it was led by a man named Faulkner, who was the nephew of the novelist. You know, his hometown was Oxford, Mississippi. And when that unit arrived, more than half the people were seriously injured. They'd had to drive through the mob, and the people were throwing full-size bricks at them in the jeeps as they drove by. Faulkner, as a matter of fact, I was talking to him, and I looked down, and I noticed that his fingers were dripping blood. He had a shattered elbow from being hit in the side by one of those bricks. One of the people who were killed was a French newsman with a red beard and a beret. Absolutely no connection with the dispute whatsoever, but somebody must have figured that he was one of those outside agitators, because he certainly didn't look like a Mississippian, so they marched him around the other side of a building and shot him in the back of the head from less than an inch away. Just executed him. Obviously by mistake. He was just a newsman there to report on the scene. The riot ended about 5 o'clock in the morning when the troops arrived, and maybe I'll try to recreate that scene for you because it's something that I'll never forget. The troops came to the campus marching behind a border patrol car that was driving very slowly into the oval, and at that time of the morning the mob was down to the real creeps that had come out from under stones all over the South in response to General Walker's summons. Remember, he got on the air and he called for all the defenders of the Constitution to come and save Mississippi, and some of these people came, and that's what we were down to at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they were sort of milling around about 50 yards away with their bricks and Molotov cocktails, and somebody threw a Molotov cocktail made out of a Coke bottle, and it hit under the patrol car and burst into flames. The flames went skyward, and the car moved off the flames, and the troops were right behind at right shoulder arms, and they marched right through the flames without breaking step. And as they did that, there was sort of an involuntary gasp out of this ragtag and bobtail mob, and they fell back a step or two. Just the visual shock of the troops marching without batting an eye through the flames, and the riot was over right there. From there on, they just sort of drifted away into the morning mist. And I feel that I learned from that the way to get rid of a riot is not to spare the horses. You've got to get there with as much force as you possibly can, and if your force is overwhelming enough, the riot will end and there won't be any more people hurt, any more people killed, because that's the only way to bring people to their senses when they're in this state of insanity that constitutes a real mob, a real riot. There were some kind of amusing things about this episode. We were in the Lyceum building there as the riot started. It was ringed by marshals, and the mob was sort of surrounding the building, and Ed Gutman, who's now the national news editor of the LA Times, had Robert Kennedy on the phone, and he was trying to describe the situation. He was groping for words, and he said, "Bob," he said, it's like the Alamo. And Kennedy said, "Well, Ed," he said, "you better get busy. You know what happened to those fellows." Afterwards, a couple days afterwards, Nick Katzenbach and I were approached by a general in the Signal Corps of the Army. He said, Mr. Katzenbach, he said, we're very proud of our equipment in the Signal Corps. We have the latest radio and communications equipment in the world, where our men are highly trained. We're really proud of our capabilities, and yet you were beating us to the White House with intelligence by 45 minutes. He said, "I just have got to find out from you how you were doing it." And Nick said, "Well, General," he said, "when you go on one of these expeditions, you have to remember to bring a dime." And you call National 81414 and say, "Mrs. Lincoln, don't hang up." That really was the situation. We had the President on one line and the Attorney General on the other. And it caused some changes, believe me, in the command structure of the Army before we were through, because I suppose in the ordinary situation, the man in the trenches yells for help, and he's heard perhaps by a sergeant who yells, and finally it gets to a first lieutenant or somebody who sends 7 or 8 people to help out. But here we were talking to the President, who began beating the table and yelling for reinforcements, and they began coming from as far away as Alaska and Hawaii and Turkey By the time the whole incident was over, there were more troops in Mississippi than are called for by the contingency plan to defend the United States from attack by the Soviet Union. The Army was just not set to cope with presidential orders for reinforcement at that level, and they just were unable to shut off the pipeline. Later in the period that I was back there, I had the opportunity to get involved in the drafting, the development, the drafting of 3 or 4 of the major pieces of legislation that have become a part of our law over this period of time. I'm the principal draftsman of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was drafted in May and June of 1963, of the Voting Rights Bill that followed a year later, under President Johnson, of the Poverty Bill, which was the first major piece of legislation under the Johnson administration, drafted in January, February of '64, and of the Immigration Reform Bill that was signed into law a little more than a year ago, got us rid of the national origins quota system that we had in our law for so long, to our great discredit, I think, as a nation. Anyway, we're rid of it now. I think that I got an opportunity, really, in this whole range of experience over 3.5 years, of how you take the skills of a lawyer and put them to work on the problems of government and produce something that will work, something that can get the approval of practical people, not just Democrats, but Republicans too. Something that can go into effect and implement the ideals and the principles that we can all agree upon. Something that will get the ideals out of the speeches and off the paper and into reality, into our lives, where they can have some impact, where they can do the job. I didn't find out anything back there about how you get yourself elected, but I think if I can get myself elected, I know how to get hold of some of the handles and make the machinery go, how to make something happen in this process of government of ours. And I think that's really what needs to happen in the job that I'm trying to get elected to, the office of Secretary of State of California. That's the 3rd ranking job in the executive branch of our state government. And yet there's hardly a day goes by that somebody doesn't come up to me, there have been 2 so far today and there were 3 yesterday, and says something like, why do you even want to be Secretary of State? Isn't that kind of a nothing job? Well, we've had such an inactive fellow in that job for so long that many people in the state don't know it exists, this office, and others think of it as a minor, almost clerical post. Well, believe me, there's a lot more to it than that. I see the job essentially in terms of 2 halves, and one half consists of a series of important technical jobs that are the responsibility of the Secretary of State. One of those is that he administers the elections. I wanted to talk to you first about the corporation law, the general corporation law of California. And that's a job that is not terribly exciting to the man in the street, but it's important to lawyers, it's important to the rapidly growing number of people who are involved in corporate affairs one way or another, and it's important to me. I was a practicing lawyer in that field, and I got sufficiently interested that I wrote a little book about California's general corporation law that was published by Harvard in 1962. And to me, this is an important, interesting, and challenging field in which there's work to be done, in which I can accomplish something I'd like to do. By far the most important and interesting job that the Secretary of State has is that he administers the elections code. He's our state's chief elections officer, and he administers all these laws under which we qualify to participate in the democratic process. The registration laws and the laws under which candidates qualify to run, and the laws that establish the elections process and the political process, set up the political parties and their mechanisms. And I think I could do a good job in this area because I've been the President's principal advisor on election law problems for 3.5 years. I've had some first-class experience in this specific field. But above all, what I'd like to do is to put to work this experience that I've had in formulating new legislation. Because if there's any part of our law here in California that's seriously behind the times, it's our elections code. This is a part of our law. This elections code is a generation behind the times. It's full of ideas and procedures that were formulated in the time of Hiram Johnson, back before the First World War. And a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then. We can do better now. We can improve our registration laws to make it easier for people to get into the democratic process so that it will work better and be more responsive. People will be elected more readily who will do what the people want. And we particularly need to simplify the process so that we can draw in the people at the lower end of the educational and economic spectrum. They're the people who are hit worst by misgovernment, by government that isn't responsive to the people's problems. And we need to bring those people in. There are other things that need to be done. It'll take 15 months, 18 months to 2 years to produce a really first-class, up-to-date, modernized elections code. To me, that's the most important job that lies before the Secretary of State of California now. We need a new elections code. He should formulate a first-class one, get it before the legislature, and then try to get it enacted. The other half of this job, as I see it, is its potential for making a contribution to the whole process of state government. And the fellow that I always think of in trying to describe what I have in mind under this heading is a man named Alan Cranston. He's the controller of California. Everybody knows him. He's a major figure in state government. The controller's job is the lowest ranking job that's filled by a statewide election. And yet he is a major figure in state government. So was Tom Kuchel. He's a senator now. He was a major figure when he was controller. It isn't the job. It's them. It's the individuals. All these statewide jobs are the same in that they offer a potential for making a contribution, for being a member of the team of statewide officials that try to develop solutions to the big problems. You don't have to do it. You can do your technical job and hide out. But the opportunity is there. I'd like to develop it. If I'm elected, I'm going to try to be a full-fledged member of the team that tries to develop a good legislative program that deals with the tough state issues like education and urban problems, civil rights, all the hard ones. And tries to get the sensible measures through the legislature into reality. So that's what I see in the job that I'm trying to get elected to. As I see the campaign situation that I'm in, it's mainly a matter of communication, reaching enough people. My opponent, who will be here this afternoon, is a man who's grown old in the job. He's 78 years old, had the job for 24 years. His father held it for 35 years before him. And I think it's fair to say that he does not have any of the professional and technical qualifications that you need to participate in a meaningful way in the basic work of the office. He's not a lawyer. He doesn't have any professional or technical training. He's never gone to college. I'm sure he's had a lot of experience. But I think basically the flaws in the performance of the office flow from the fact that he has not got the professional capacity to get involved deeply himself in the work of the office. The office does well on routine matters, but it falls down in handling the hard questions that occasionally arise. The civil service people don't want to do anything adventurous. They don't want to make new decisions. And the man who's running the office does not have the capacity, the background to get involved himself. And I think it's fair to say also that he's never accepted responsibility for bringing the law along, for keeping it up to date, the substantive law that he administers. And the result is that we've fallen behind in these areas. I think we'll get the overwhelming support of an overwhelming majority of the people who know about this office, and the candidates and the issues and the programs involved. And the main problem is to reach enough of the 19 million people in this state so that a lot of them will be half of all of it. It's hard to do that. You know, this is a big state and it's terribly hard to reach enough people. It's hard to get enough people's attention. You just got to amplify your voice beyond the people that you can meet and talk to. Somebody was making a speech for me at a fundraiser the other night. Said that if I stood on the busiest corner in the state and shook hands with people all day long and introduced myself and talked to them, at the end of the day I'd have met 300 more people would have come into the state from outside than I was able to meet that day, and I'd have fallen behind. And it's almost that bad. You've got to have the electronic voice amplification that's provided by television and radio and all the paraphernalia of campaigning like billboards and postcards and word of mouth. And I hope that you'll help to solve this problem of communication that we have in this race for Secretary of State. You're going to be among the very few groups of people that gets to see my opponent. He's only made one quasi-public appearance in his life that I can see since he's held public office. He had a little thing over at Cal State LA a couple weeks ago, and he specified that he would come only if they would agree that there was to be no press, no TV, no other candidates, and no members of the public except people on an approved guest list. Now, I made such an attack on that arrangement that he ultimately was obliged to let in the press. He told the press that it was his first press conference in 18 years, since 1948. And so I tell him, boys, get your calendars ready. The next press conference is 1984. It'll be 96 then. But I hope you'll take a look at us both and give other people the benefit of your judgment about what we've had to say. Now, there's just one thing more that one idea that I'd like to express before I subside and answer questions, and that is that I hope that you and I can know each other and work together on this business of state politics and government for a long time. I was 37 last June, and as politicians go, that's fairly dry behind the ears. I know that to many of you I look like an old man at 37, but believe me, that's pretty young. I spoke to the Young Democrats about a month ago, and a kid came up to me afterwards and he said, Mr. Schlei, I've got it all figured out. You're going to be 12 years younger than Governor Brown is now when Robert Kennedy finishes his second term as President of the United States. You probably couldn't follow the assumptions there, but I think what it boils down to is that I'll be 51 in 1980. So I'll be around when you're corporation presidents and you have children that are going to this institution. You'll be around, and I'll still be around too. So we've got some time to work on these problems, and I hope you'll help me get off the ground in this process. I'm interested in government and politics. My whole adult life, this has seemed to me the field that's the most important. This is where things that are happening, there are things to be done that are important. I've tried to get the kind of education and experience that it takes to get something accomplished, something done in this field. I hope you'll help me. I hope we can work together over a long period of time, take on some tough problems together, and get some good things done. Thank you very much.
Now, we'll take some questions. Just put your hand up, and please stand up and speak very loudly so we can all hear. And we won't have to use the microphones if necessary. Yeah, back there.
Your proposal for election reform, do you advocate against the present system of nonpartisan municipal elections?
No, I haven't advocated that, but it's something that is one of the things that I would have to study and think about. Now, I believe in political parties, and I believe in partisanship. You know, our political parties are the marketing end of the process of government. I wonder if you'd manage to wait until it's your turn before you talk. It's all right. In politics, parties are the institutions that we use to sell candidates and programs. And it's good for our society and for our system if they're healthy and if they're active. And nonpartisan elections have the danger that people can get elected who are able to use advertising techniques, who are able to leapfrog over the leadership processes that really safeguard us from demagogues and people who really could get us into some trouble. So I think there are arguments against nonpartisan elections. I think there are arguments for political parties and for partisanship. But that doesn't happen to be a part of the elections code that I've got a fully formulated set of ideas about. I'd be interested in getting yours if you have some and you want to write to me.
Yeah, back there.
Well, I'm for it. I'm for it. Either 18 or 19, depending on the situation, the tactical situation in the legislature. I think that today people of that age are 3 or 4 times as well informed as their parents were 10, 20 years ago. Half the people who voted for Abe Lincoln were illiterate. They knew nothing about him except a party symbol or a tiny bit of word of mouth. And today, people of 18 or 19 have access to all the news of the world. They know a lot more about the ideas and programs of candidates than the vast majority of people did a few years ago. And I think that young people such as yourselves are actually tend to be better informed than their elders who are preoccupied in the business of making a living and taking care of their families and a little bit tend to push public affairs a little into the background. And of course, if you're old enough to go to Vietnam, and if you're old enough to get married and have children, and if you're old enough to engage in activities like this, it certainly seems to me that you're old enough to have a say in what kind of government we should have.
Right here.
I'm sure we all read with great pleasure the endorsement of the Los Angeles Times for your cause. Now, how much can this aid you and affect your campaign, and how much does the Times endorsement of that actor detract from it?
Well, I think from my narrow point of view, the Times endorsement is perhaps even more helpful to me because they endorsed that actor. I think the Times endorsement is influential primarily with Republicans and independents. I think Democrats have come to feel that the Times is not necessarily on their side, and so Democrats really have gotten pretty blasé about who the Times is for or not for. But I think Republicans are influenced, and the fact that they endorsed Mr. Reagan, I think, makes their endorsement all the more plausible to convince active Republicans. But I don't think that the endorsement for governor really has that much of an effect. People make up their own minds about who they want to be governor or president. On the offices like Secretary of State, on the ballot propositions, they want to hear the voice of a newspaper because they figure the newspaper is going to make a rational decision. And I think that's true. I think that's the attitude they took. I was delighted with their approach to the whole thing. We had an interview, and they asked me about my program and qualifications, and I got the endorsement. I was surprised and very pleased. I think it'll be helpful.
Yes, Renee.
What, as Secretary of State, can you do to speed up the actual voting process? For example, the use of voting machines in Los Angeles County.
Well, I think that we've got to have a mechanized and electronic means of counting the vote. Now, whether that means we're going to have voting machines or counting machines, I really don't know. There are at least 30 different automatic ways of tallying the vote. And it's pretty plain to me that we've got in a fix where we're kind of a laughing stock in this field. Every time we have an election, the Eastern press stands around slapping their thighs with merriment while our machines spew out waste paper and we can't figure out who won for 4 or 5 days. I do not have any easy answers to that. I see problems with the use of voting machines and with the use of some of the counting machines that I've seen. But I intend to accept responsibility, if I'm elected Secretary of State, for trying to work out a solution that's acceptable around the state, that's acceptable and feasible and reasonably inexpensive, so that we can solve this problem once and for all. I think that the reason we haven't found an answer is that we have not had any leadership on the statewide level. There are things that are done in our society that are infinitely more complicated than this. The fact that banks are able to cash checks, that whole process of checking accounts is 12 times as complicated as voting. And the fact that we have dial telephones, my goodness, it's so much more complicated to have a dial telephone system than to have an electronic vote counting system. So it can be done. I think what we need is some statewide leadership to get us to focus on this problem, to get us to agree on 1 or 2 or 3 basic systems that could be used statewide, and then chivvy the legislature into taking some effective action. But I tell you that while I don't have any quick answers to give you, I intend to accept responsibility for finding and implementing an answer to that problem.
Right there. In the glasses all over there.
Why is it that the national government, looking at the national government, and came to California and working state office? Because after
Of course, I started out pointing towards state government. I was running for the state assembly in 1962, having worked in state politics for 5 years or so, when President Kennedy asked me to stop that and pulled me out to do this job. But I found back there that I had reached the limit. I felt that I'd reached the limit of what I could accomplish in an appointive job. Basically, we live in a democracy, and there's a limit to what you can do if you don't go out and get people to vote for you. In this country, the decisions are made by people. The basic decisions are made by people who have persuaded people in large numbers that they ought to have a share in responsibility. They ought to get to make some of the decisions. I have some ideas about what should be done. I'd like to play a role in that process. I felt that the time had come for me to leave that and try to get into this process, the elective process. And it's something that I wanted to do my whole life. This excursion to Washington was essentially something to the side of the main line of development, and I feel that I'm returning to what I was moving toward my whole life until 1962.
We'll have a couple more questions. Just time for a few more. Yes, right there.
Yes, how much time and energy will you be spending fulfilling your promise to state offices opposed to furthering political ambitions, let's say on the congressional level or Senate?
Well, to the extent that I have any political ambitions in the federal line, which I don't know that I have particularly, I think the best way to further them would be to be a first-class public official. And I intend to spend my full time being a first-class public official if I get elected.
Yes, right here.
You stated that you wanted to play an active role in the executive team. What if that team is headed by Republicans?
Well, if the team is headed by a Republican, I obviously can do my own jobs. Will have my own domain. To the extent that there's an opportunity to do more, it really would depend pretty largely on what the head of the team, was willing to accept. Now, I would try to be useful. I consider that when you take an oath of office, you're supposed to function as well as you can, and partisanship ought to be distinctly secondary. So I would try to do that. It would be up to the governor how much he would be willing to accept. Now, I'm not altogether joking when I say to you that if Mr. Reagan is elected, they're going to need some help from people who've had experience in government. And so I will try to carry out that part of what I've projected as the function of the Secretary of State, but it would be up to them. We'll see how much he's willing to accept if that situation arises.
Yeah.
How do you feel about changing the initiative referendum process?
Well, I think that needs considerable repair. I really do. I think for one thing that there ought to be a prohibition of paying people to gather signatures. As it now stands, you can get any idiot measure on the ballot if you have enough money to pay these companies that will guarantee you signatures for anything. They don't say we'll take only certain kind of propositions. They say for X dollars we'll get it on the ballot. That to me is an outrage. This was a procedure that was created for spontaneous public outcry for issues that really were so appealing to people they wanted to go around the legislature. Well, now we're not doing it that way. We ought to make it improper, illegal, to pay people to gather signatures. And I wish that Proposition 1A had done a little different, been a little different than it is. You know, there are two kinds of initiatives. One is a constitutional initiative that changes the Constitution. Another is a statutory initiative that just changes the statute books. And Proposition 1A, the Constitutional Revision Commission, wanted to encourage people to go the statutory route so we wouldn't have a Constitution cluttered up with all kinds of garbagey measures. Every time we have an election, something new is added. So they created a disparity between the requirements. You need 8%. You need signatures amounting to 8% of the ballots cast for governor in the last election to get a constitutional initiative on the ballot. We used to need 8% for a statutory initiative, but this Proposition 1A would lower the requirements for a statutory initiative to 5, so that there's You need 5 for a statutory initiative, 8 for constitutional. The idea being that people will all go the statutory route because it's easier. I just wish they'd added 3% to the constitutional requirement rather than subtracted 3 from statutory. I would increase the difficulty of the requirements, I think, given the opportunity to do so. Now, what we need, I think, above all, is a procedure to rewrite what appears on the ballot in the interests of clarity and simplicity. You may remember Proposition 15, I guess it was, a few years ago, about pay TV. It had a triple negative in it. I'm a lawyer and I read a lot of complicated gook, but I had to read that about 5 times to figure out whether no meant yes or no or what. Really was almost impossible to follow. I don't know how most people did on that. There have been other offending propositions. And I think we ought to have a commission consisting of people who are already in the government, so it doesn't cost us any extra money. We have the Attorney General and the Secretary of State and the representative of the governor and maybe somebody from each house that could hold hearings and rewrite ballot propositions as necessary in order to ensure that they present the issue as simply and clearly as possible. I think that could eliminate a lot of the dangers in this initiative process that we have if we could ensure that we had something clear and understandable instead of a lot of public relations and legal gobbledygook. So that's a few of the things I'd like to do to the initiative process.
This will be the last question. Yes.
I'd like to ask a question about elections again. It seems to me in the past what has happened is that minor parties have been pushed off the ballot because it makes more and more restrictive laws in the election law of being able to stay on the ballot. What is your concern about that?
Well, I think that minority parties have certainly made a terrific contribution to our political process over the years. They've turned out to be the one way of getting new ideas accepted. They come sailing in with some crazy idea that nobody will buy, and as soon as they begin to get support for it, the major parties take it over. They provide an opportunity for an idea to get tried out in the marketplace without the major parties having to put their necks on the block. And it would be better perhaps if the major parties were more adventurous, but realistically speaking, maybe we're only going to get ideas in this way. And I would be sympathetic to the idea of making it easier for minority parties to function. There are problems. There are all sorts of collateral problems, like the equal time requirements of the FCC. Pretty soon no candidate can get on the air because if they let anybody on, they'd have to let 7 people on. In the primary elections where I was running, there were 7 candidates in the Democratic primary. Well, believe me, I didn't get on any programs that weren't regularly scheduled news programs. They're exempt from the equal time requirement. There wasn't anybody that wanted to hear 7 Democratic candidates for Secretary of State on the TV or the radio. And when you encourage minority parties, you create these collateral problems. So it's a thicket of difficult issues. I've gotten some correspondence from people who are interested in the fates of particular minority parties. And I'm terribly interested, and I've been carrying it around in my briefcase now for 3 months, trying to get a chance to read it and absorb it, try to make some sense of it. I think I've got to wait until campaign ends and I have more time to look it over. But those are my general ideas on the subject.
On behalf of all of us in the speakers program, we'd like to thank you once again for appearing and wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much.